Can we have a huge round of applause for that? I sincerely needs a bigger round of applause if you can. Thank you.
Today is 139 years ago when the first indentured laborers actually landed in Fiji. A lot, of course, has happened since then. There were approximately over 60,000 indentured laborers that were actually brought to Fiji between 1879 and 1916. They were fundamentally brought to Fiji to work as what we call indentured laborers. The British had actually ended formerly slavery, where under the slavery system you had a lot of Africans in particular that were transported from Africa to what is now known as the United States of America. They were taken to the Caribbean. And of course we also, in this part of the world too, we had what we had called the black-birded communities too. So we had people of, in particular from Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, in particular Solomon Islands, they were actually brought here also as laborers into Fiji. And some of their descendants, of course, still live in Fiji. And then, of course, the British, when the slavery was formally ended, there was still a huge demand for labor, but a demand for cheap labor and a demand for labor that fundamentally did not have any rights. So the British, being very ingenious, came up with what they called the indenture labor system. And the indenture labor system, of course, assured them of a supply of laborers. And they were transported from British India. And I say British India because in those days there was no Bangladesh, there was no Pakistan. Certain parts of India were occupied by the Portuguese, and down south you had the French near Pondicherry and places like that that had occupied certain parts of India. So British India, as we know, stretched all the way from what we know today, almost the border of Afghanistan, all the way across to the Burmese border. And so they sent people across to South Africa, to Guyana, to the Caribbean, of course to Mauritius, and also to Fiji. And Fiji was the only Pacific Island country where indentured laborers were actually sent across to. Many, of course, if you read this book here, which is put together by Dr. Ahmad Ali of USP, it's the only book actually, or account, where he individually interviewed the survivors of the indentured labor system. And thankfully, actually, he did do that, because frankly, we have no other documentary evidence or even video evidence of people actually who served the indenture system telling quite graphically about their experiences. And as highlighted in Parliament today, it was actually very interesting. Last year when we commemorated the arrival of the last boat, Sutlej 5, that came in 1916, we had legal officers, lawyers from the AG's office reading out the stories of these various indentured laborers. And in fact, I want to highlight the names, the stories we read out. There was a gentleman called Pancham. There was another gentleman called Mahadeo, Lotan. There was a gentleman called Mahabir, Lakpat, and Abdul Aziz. These were the stories that were read out. And right at this ground over here, it was very interesting. We had a lot of people who said to us, they said, we didn't know that the Girmits actually went through this process. We did not know that the descendants of the Indo-Fijians actually were whipped. They lived in coolie lines. There's a high rate of suicide, that there was disease and infection. There was actually rape, there's sexual harassment, sexual exploitation. Of course, many of these subject areas aren't spoken about openly because it was seen as a sense of shame. So this is unfortunately the hardcore reality of what actually happened. So many of the people are, just to recap, as you know, that when the indenture system, they were paid some form of money for the services. People had to wake up, if you read the stories, at 4 a.m. in the morning, work till late. If they felt you were slow, you were whipped. Men would come around on horses. Sometimes women were picked up for the enjoyment of the overseer. It did happen. And of course, we had people who ran away too, because they could not actually handle the hardship. They had very little to eat. The ratio of men to female was quite horrendous. At one point in time, there was something like 50 men to 1 woman. And then they had to bring special ships to perhaps curb some of the problems that was arising. As a result of the socio-economic issues, there were a lot of suicides too. One other important fact that people did not know about is that many of the people who served Girmit, now why do we call them Girmitiers? Because the British said this is an agreement between us and you to work. So it's an agreement. So many of the Girmitiers could not say agreement. So they said Girmit. In the same way, I mean, I discovered only a few years ago that you know how you go to the sugarcane fields, they say kantap. Kantap is actually cane top. So, but they still use it as a word. So the agreement, they could not say agreement, they call it Girmit, and then became known as Girmitiers. So that's actually the historical, epistemological basis of that word. Now, many of them who could not actually handle the hardship used to run away. And the people who actually gave them refuge were people who were living in Fiji, and they were the Itauke villagers. And then because some of them used to feel sorry for them and used to keep them in the villages, the British saw that as a problem. And they passed an ordinance. And that ordinance made it illegal to harbor a runaway Girmitier. So again, it became an offense. So if I ran to the village and the villagers kept me, the village would then could be, fined or sent to prison for harboring a runaway Girmitier. Now, of course, after 1916, when the last lot were brought over and formally indenture system ended, a few years after that, in 1920, many of them could not return because they did not have enough funds to return. The deal was that you came and served 5 years. And if you wanted to go back to India, you have to serve another 5 years and they'll pay you to go back. Because the money that they earned was not even enough to, survive for the next couple of days. So many of them could not return. And of course, after a while, this became home. A lot of huge disconnectivity. So it's very interesting. I mean, I don't want to bore you too much with a long speech, but I met a gentleman, just to give you a story. I met a gentleman who I met in New South Wales a few years ago, and he came to Fiji. He was originally from Fiji, and I think it was his grandfather or great-grandfather who came as an indentured laborer, and in fact his grandmother too. And he had gone to the archives and tried to trace. The archives does have some information. And he found the name of the village that his grandfather came from. And he went looking for that village. It was in Bihar, in the state of Bihar. And when he actually got there, they found that the village had actually moved and the village name had changed. But anyway, he eventually tracked down his grandfather's family, or great-grandfather's family. And they told the story, they knew about it. And apparently his great-grandfather was in love with one of the zamindar. Zamindar is a landowner, a big landowner's daughter. And he was a Muslim and she was a Hindu. So it was a big deal. So the local council had made him perform some, what you call publicly held discipline. So, they do what they call the murga. The murga? You have to hold your ears like that and go up and down, I think 20 times. So he was really annoyed by it all. So his grandmother and him, the daughter of the zamindar, ran away from home, from Bihar. They had never seen a big river. They had never even seen the sea. And they ran away to Calcutta, and where they were picked up by these people, who used to go around saying, look, we can give you a fantastic life around the corner. So 6 months later, they were in Fiji. But the interesting thing was that this family who he met, the descendants of his grandfather, they have absolutely no clue. They themselves had never seen the sea. They lived right in the middle of Bihar. So when he was leaving, he said they gave me a sack of soil and gave me some grains and said, take it back to the family to show them this is the soil and this is the grain. He said they did not know that Australian quarantine laws are very strict. You see, so there is those kind of stories too. Now, the issue I think in Fiji is, and this is probably a point that we need to be able to talk about a lot more freely, and I must say, ladies and gentlemen, it is only through the leadership of the Honourable Prime Minister that today we are openly talking about these issues. Any country, no matter which country it is, we must be able to talk freely about our history. We must be able to talk freely about the facts that took place. And as you know, the history or narrative is only written by people who are what they say the victors. They will only write what they want you to know. Many people do not know this, but there is something like 25,000 to 25 to 30,000 Itaukes who died because of measles in the late 1800s. Not many people know this. And as a result of that, the population did not grow as fast. But we do not know about this. It's not necessarily taught in schools. It was a disease that was not indigenous to Fiji. It was brought in by the colonizers. So there are many aspects of our history that we all need to understand to be able to be a lot more liberated. So in the same way the history about Girmit is, when the Girmitians who stayed back, they'd come out essentially from slavery and they're trying to eke out a living in this country. So you hear stories that for them, most of them were illiterate. They did not know how to read or write. So for them, the biggest focus was education. They saw that as a way of getting out of poverty, as a way of perhaps getting some form of social status in society. So it was a big deal when somebody became a clerk in government. It was a big deal if somebody got a job in government. Some of you I know shaking your heads, and it's a fact. It used to be a big deal. It was even a bigger deal if you owned a bicycle. Or even if you became a teacher, it was a very big deal. So you see, this was the approach that they took. The other aspect of it, of course, was they wanted representation. They wanted equality. They wanted representation at the Legislative Council level. And what actually happened was the then colonial government, due to certain pressures, in particular by the European settlers, said that they could not give them franchise. They could not give them the right to vote. So they appointed a man called Badri Maharaj from Suvarnasori area to represent them in the Legislative Council. They rejected that. They said we want the right to vote. And then the colonial government said eventually that you can only have the right to vote if you actually vote along ethnic lines. So they rejected that. And I read out a quote today in Parliament where S.B. Patel, who said we want one man, one vote, because in those days only men voted. Women did not vote. Women got the right to vote in Fiji in 1963. In those days also the Itauke did not have the right to vote. Both Itauke men and women got the right to vote when women got the right to vote in 1963. Prior to that, the Legislative Council members were selected through the Council of Chiefs. So the Indo-Fijians got the right to vote, the men in 1928-29, led by Pandit Vishnu Deo. And he again moved a motion in the Legislative Assembly to say that we must have common franchise, we must have equality of citizenry. That was defeated. And that is a sign of solidarity. They did not effectively attend Legislative Council right up to World War II as a sign of protest. Of course, after World War II, things changed. But the point that I wanted to make, ladies and gentlemen, is that unfortunately in Fiji for many years and many decades, because our history of what happened to the Itauke people, to the Indo-Fijians, the Girmitians, was written by the British, there was one single narrative that was followed. And because of that, we weren't given the space, the intellectual space, to be able to hear all the stories. And there's been a view that if you hear one story, it should be at the expense of the other. That is a way of thinking we need to get away from. Just because we talk about the indenture history, it does not mean we cannot also talk about the injustices that the Itauke people faced. We cannot talk about the injustices that the women faced, or other people faced, or the Chinese settlers faced, whoever they were. Because in Fiji there has been this sense by colonial governments and unfortunately subsequently by the independence governments that we can only follow one narrative. Our richness is in our diversity and our ability to listen to all the stories, all the narratives, all the histories. And that is what makes a country a mature country, a country that is comfortable with its past, a country that may recognize injustices, but it looks forward to how we can fix it up. So, ladies and gentlemen, this occasion, of course, is just a small gathering over here where we are talking about what actually happened during Girmit and, of course, subsequent to that. But next year, of course, will be 140 years since the arrival of the Girmitiers into Fiji. And government has already indicated that we hope to have some national celebrations. Our ability to understand our history and tell the histories and the stories does not come about just because we have a one-off public holiday, as was said today in Parliament. I think the NFP said that, we should have had a one-off holiday to be able to commemorate it. That's nonsense. It's your ability to be able to talk about the history, your ability to be able to mainstream the history. That's what matters. It's your ability to come to comfort with the history and recognize it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do not want to make a very long speech, but essentially to say that as a nation, it is very critical for us to be able to recognize what happened in Fiji with all the different Fijians that we have, with all the different backgrounds. The indenture experience, the Girmit experience is one of them. And perhaps it is one of those stories that's perhaps the least told and perhaps the least uttered and actually fully, in a cathartic manner, talked about. That's very, very important. At one stage, there was very little, for example, display at the museum about the Girmit history. I understand now there's a lot more history being told through the museum, and I think it's very important for us to be able to have that collective memory and history about what happened in Fiji. Of course, it's also time to celebrate, because many of these people, it's only through their tenacity, the ability to survive through that, that they were able to live through Girmit, that they were able to then educate their descendants. And today we are where we are. And of course, unfortunately, the 14th of May is also the significant milestone also where we had the first military coup. As I said in Parliament today, whether it was a deliberate ploy to have the coup executed on the 14th of May as a symbolic message, or whether it was just purely coincidence, we don't know, but it would appear from the literature it was actually done deliberately on the 14th of May. But, ladies and gentlemen, we have to move away from, I think if one message we can have, and even if you read all the stories of these people, they did not politicize ethnicity. They did not politicize all of this political nonsense that we do here. They were simply ordinary human beings who faced injustice, who actually then triumphed over that. And this is their simple story. And that's what we must see everything as. We must be able to see this as a celebration of individual human beings who came to a country that was foreign to them, adopted it, their descendants adopted it, and their descendants do not know any other place other than Fiji as their home. And they, of course, now are Fijians. They've always been Fijians, but now they can legally call themselves Fijians. They've been given the right to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the committee for organizing this function. We hope to have some national celebrations, of course, in a much bigger scale next year, celebrating the 140 years of the arrival of the indentured laborers to Fiji. It is, of course, a occasion where hopefully people aren't as solemn as we are today, because it is also a time to celebrate, not just to recognize, but to celebrate what actually had happened and what these people went through, and actually did quite well out of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks once again to the committee. I hope that these sorts of occasions will be able to enable not just people who are elderly, but also the young people to be able to understand and appreciate what actually happened, and to be able to have a better understanding of our history. And I think all of us have a responsibility as Fijians to be able to understand everybody's story. We also need to understand, for example, the alienation of Itauke land, where people actually bought land by giving some food and a gun, where then lands became freehold land. We need to be able to understand, for example, how the Chinese traders came to Fiji, what they went through, what are their stories, how the Solomon Islanders endured the indenture system too. If all of us are able to talk about freely and openly and appreciate that, it makes your country a lot more vibrant, a lot more mature, and you're able to then forge a much better future ahead. Because any country that cannot deal with its history and recognize it won't be able to be mature enough to be able to face the future. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you a good evening. Unaka.